What is up, guys? Welcome to episode 60 of the Triage Method podcast. If you are watching this on YouTube, that means that our first trial of recording the video was successful. So that means that we can't troll each other visually anymore while the person is talking. So that's definitely going to be like a barrier to a successful podcast. But we'll see how it goes. Paddy, how are you this week? You finished your exams?
Yeah, I am positively, absolutely fantastic. Exams are over. College is over, summertime, going away in 3 weeks, and it's just going to be glorious. So I'm ready for a summer of just hard work and fun.
Where are you going for the summer?
We've already discussed this on the podcast, Gary. People don't need to fucking know and hear the same stuff over and over and over again. They know.
For everyone that doesn't know, you'll just have to, live in the darkness. But for this week,
just go back and listen to all the other podcasts. Easy.
For this week, we're going to discuss feelings. Not feelings in the emotional sense. We're going to talk about feelings as they relate to exercise, and particularly the misapplication of feelings in exercise prescription. And this is actually something that I wrote about last year. I think it was actually it might have even been this week last year, because I remember I was in Nusa Lembongan. Although it might have been later in the summer. But anyway, irrelevant. It was something we wrote about last year. It's on our website. Some of you might have come across that. And basically, the reason this is an important topic is because very often when people are going to the gym and they're running through their exercise program and they're doing specific exercises or learning something off someone else, their main method of evaluation in the moment tends to be how something feels, since you're not able to actually assess the outcomes prospectively. You can't know what outcomes you're going to get from doing a certain exercise, so you're going to use some sort of feeling, which is then probably going to be like a surrogate marker that you trust is going to lead to the desired outcome. So that's kind of why this is an important topic. And there's multiple different avenues that we're going to go down with this. Some of them are going to be related to things like mobility exercises. Some of them are going to be related to, for example, strength training exercises that feel good, that they mightn't always be useful exercises, and even related to how hard an exercise set feels, why you shouldn't always just rely on that. So that's kind of our starting point for this discussion.
That's cool. And when you say it's a discussion, what you really mean is you're going to talk and then I'm going to strategically throw some input in, and that's it.
I think that's fair enough. So I'll start with, I want to focus on the mobility stuff to start off with, because I think that's quite important, because it's a very prevalent concept that I see basically every day on social media. And we last year, both Paddy and I, we went to do the functional range conditioning course. You'll have heard our review of that on the podcast before. But we went and did that course essentially to try and get a better idea of, I guess, what people were being taught when they were being taught, these different methodologies around quote unquote mobility training. So that's something we've discussed in the podcast before, but that leads into this discussion. So some of the things that will come up on that course and in the methods that people who are certified in that, what they would essentially be promoting, and we're certified in that as well. But what they often promote is the feeling of getting into end ranges of motion, and the feeling that is associated with that tends to be really strong and intense. I'll give you a couple of specific examples to try and make this a little bit clearer. For example, if you are kneeling down in a hip flexor stretch position, okay, and what you do is you bring your heel up to meet your bum, that's going to basically put you in a position where your hamstring is really, really short and it's cramping. That's
especially if you're contracting the glute as well. So that's a key
Exactly. And it's basically a case where you're taking that muscle, the hamstring muscle, because it crosses the knee joint and the hip joint. You're taking it and shortening it at the hip, because your hip is extended, meaning you're squeezing your glute, as Paddy said. And you're also squeezing your hamstring because you're flexing your knee up as much as you can. So you're bending your knee, bringing your heel towards your bum. The result of that tends to be that the hamstring is in its fully shortened position, and there's a really intense feeling that's close to cramping, and that can potentially be cramping at times, because you're encountering what's known as active insufficiency. And active insufficiency is basically just a way of describing the phenomenon when a muscle has nowhere else to go. So if you think of like a muscle as being, you know, these fibers that are kind of linked together. This will make sense if you're watching the video. Fibers that are linked together, when they totally link together in the fully shortened position, they have nowhere else to go. So they can't shorten anymore. And then that's when you start to get that sort of intense cramping sensation. It's a really intense feeling, and it's probably going to feel different to any other hamstring exercise that you've done before. And what can come along with that is the sense that, oh, this is really productive. This is going to be like strengthening me so much. I'm so weak in this position. Whereas, in fact, what you're doing is just encountering a position where you're really, really weak physiologically. As in, everyone is going to be weak in that position because that's the basic structure of like muscles on that kind of microscopic level. Like that's what's going to happen. And you can only improve that to a very small degree. As in, like you might be able to tolerate that position a little bit more, but you are not going to be building significant amounts of strength there, and you're certainly not going to be building significant amounts of muscle there. So why that is important is because if you rely solely on that feeling to guide how useful an exercise is, then you're going to be missing out on, you know, gains that are potentially being left on the table there. So that's just one example of where you're taking the hamstring and fully shortening it. Other examples might be things like if you're sitting on the floor and you straighten out your knees, so you have your knees straight or legs straight while you're sitting up on the floor, and you lift up one leg, that's going to give you a cramping sensation on the upper thigh. So your rectus femoris and your hip flexor muscles there, they're going to feel like they're kind of cramping up. And again, that's totally normal because that rectus femoris, one of your quad muscles, that crosses the hip and the knee, so it's encountering that active insufficiency again. So it's going to feel like it's really short, like it's cramping up. And again, that might have a specific purpose in some cases, but it's not necessarily an indicator that that is a really useful exercise for you at this point in time. So I often think of these sorts of things as being almost like parlor tricks. You see them done very often at seminars, because what you can essentially do is I can pick out a really strong guy from the crowd who might be a powerlifter, you know, really strong person, and I put them in one of these positions, and I'm like, oh, you see, you're actually not strong, your hamstring's actually weak. Whereas in fact, what you're doing is you're just putting a person in a position where you expect them to have this sensation, and then it makes them feel like there's all these sorts of deficits that aren't really deficits that need to be addressed. So that's kind of why I think it's something that's worth acknowledging. Can you think of any other examples related to that, Paddy, that might be worth considering or relatable that people might have seen on the social medias?
Maybe not something that some people have seen in social media, but something you may have experienced to illustrate this point. Like, you can get this active insufficiency with your eyes, right? Like, you can literally look a certain way and keep trying to look that way, and eventually you'll get your eye to feel like it's cramping or even cramp, right? And you wouldn't then think that, oh, this is going to give me all kinds of fucking hypertrophic gains in my eyeballs. You know? Like, you're not going to think that. So just because you are feeling that active insufficiency doesn't mean that that is necessarily a great exercise. Now, obviously, using the eye, like, you're not trying to hypertrophy, well, most of these are not trying to hypertrophy the muscles in your eyes or around your eyes. But it shows you something that you may have experienced, or rather it explains something that you may have experienced, right? So if you're kind of going like, oh, I've never, you know, done this hamstring thing they're saying, or this quad thing they're saying, I don't really know what they're going on about. Most people have tried moving their eyes around when they were a child or whatever and got to that end range, and they're like, oh shit, oh fuck, what's going on? You know, and kind of almost scared themselves, you know? But I think for people listening or viewing, the way you actually started thinking about this and applying this is like, or what we're going to discuss now, presumably, is, okay, accept the point and go, okay, that's not indicative of a great exercise. They kind of understood that anyway. They've been listening to our podcast, they've been looking at the stuff we put out, and they're going, okay, cool, I actually understand that that's just, you know, short range insufficiency, and it just feels like that crampy sensation. You know, they're like, yeah, I understand that. I knew that wasn't really anything special, right? But how does that actually apply to the way they then treat exercises or select exercises, or rather think about exercise as a whole? Because I know I've definitely fallen into this trap before, where you don't really have a way to theorize or look at exercise. You don't have the knowledge, you don't have the experience, whatever. And you kind of are left going, okay, well, if I can feel it working in the gym, that means it's working, which is obviously to some extent correct, right? But then the way you then start measuring the effectiveness of exercises is how well you feel them, how good of a connection you get with that muscle, or did I get a good connection with that muscle? And inevitably, the exercises that you feel more of a connection are the exercises that you start getting this kind of cramping sensation. You literally bring your arm in and it's across the body and you're going, oh yeah, I really feel that in the inner upper chest there, and it's like, does that mean that's an effective exercise for that area? You know what I'm saying? Like I understand why, because I've done it myself. Like, how do we then, while we're exercising, decide whether an exercise is good or not? Should we be biasing, going, okay, well, I'm feeling this contraction very intensely, so obviously that's a good exercise? Is that a good way to think about exercise selection or exercise on the whole?
Yeah, so I suppose first things first, we're making the assumption here that we're choosing exercises with the intent of biasing a specific muscle or group of muscles. Okay, so that's kind of our starting framework. We're not talking about people with the goal of, let's say, like powerlifting, trying to maximize your 1 rep max. Like, that's a different kind of question. We're kind of speaking to people here who are going to be selecting exercises for their biceps or shoulders or chest or whatever based on feeling. Okay, and I think a nice way of breaking down a lot of kind of complicated topics and making it into a really simple message is to, like, choose an exercise that you are feeling some sort of connection on the target muscle, but also that it's somewhat even throughout the range of motion. Okay, I think that's a nice way of thinking about it, because if you take any of those exercises, for example, the ones that really feel intense in one portion, then it's kind of easy through the rest of the range of motion. Like, to give you an example, if anyone has done like a spider curl, for example, I'm not sure if most people know what that is. You're basically lying down on a bench with your arms hanging down, and you do a bicep curl. So your hands are coming up towards your forehead. At the top of that movement, it's going to feel ridiculously intense, like a really intense contraction, because again, the biceps are crossing the elbow and the shoulder, so they're shortening that bit more. And also the way that the resistance is set up in that exercise is going to make it more difficult at the top. However, at the bottom, and until you get about halfway up, it's just not challenging at all. Like there's very little work being done, and that's kind of a nice example of where this comes into play. Another way that this comes into play is like in a chest fly. Like, Paddy, you were doing that chest fly motion there a minute ago, and if you were to do that type of movement, and the cable was like just pulling your arm out, you'd feel it really intense there, but you wouldn't feel it back at the end point of the range of motion, like when your arm is kind of more in line with your body, because the cable is just pulling straight through your arm. So there are some examples of where this comes into play that you can start to think about on a broader sense, I guess. If you were to think of that quad exercise we talked about, where you're just lifting your leg up like a straight leg raise, like, think about where that is difficult. It's only difficult in one very specific point in the leg, and bring it from like a normal neutral resting position up halfway, but it's going to be really hard at the top. So when you're starting to think about choosing appropriate exercises, you're thinking about, all right, is it difficult on the target muscle that I'm trying to train, assuming that's our goal? And is it difficult through most of the range of motion that I'm actually using? Because that, to me, is an efficient way of training, because you have appropriate resistance at all points in the range. So that's the way that I would start to think about it. Do you think that makes sense? Is there any problems in that argument? What do you think?
No, it sounds good. With that then as well, it doesn't really answer the question. Well, it does, but it doesn't really answer the question. So if they're trying to choose an exercise, they're going to the gym and they're like, okay, they're saying I shouldn't choose it based on my momentary feelings in the gym, but at the same time I should be aware of them and kind of go, okay, am I getting an even feel throughout this range, whatever the exercise is, whatever the target muscle is, whatever it is, you're trying to get this even feeling throughout the range of some tension on the muscle. You're not just biasing like that fully contracted position, whether it's a curl, whether it's a lateral raise, whatever it is. You're not biasing just one pointing on, oh, I feel it loads there, so that means that this exercise is really good. They're not doing that. They're kind of going, okay, I might not feel it as intensely, but I know that I'm getting a full contraction or a full range of motion, contraction, whatever you want to call it, throughout that exercise, right? So they're doing that. But even then, it can be hard to conceptualize and think about what exercises to choose. Now, obviously, more education needs to happen. You need to understand what you're trying to achieve. You need to understand program design, et cetera, all the stuff we have talked about before. But just intuitively, since we're talking about this feeling thing, is it okay then to use the feelings the day after as a method of tracking the intensity or the effectiveness or whatever you want to say about of the workout? So, for example, I trained chest. I was listening to you guys. I did, these full ranges of motion, and I got a good contraction throughout. Maybe I did some exercises that maybe biased a little bit of shortening or maybe a bit of lengthening or whatever. They got a good complete, quote unquote, chest workout, right? And the next day they're sore in certain areas. Say they're sore on the outside of their pec, or maybe they're sore on the inside of their pec. Does that then allow them? We'll actually make it even simpler. Say they literally just did bench press and flies, right? Dumbbell flies, right? And they'd never done dumbbell flies before. Or no, they've done dumbbell flies before. They're just doing a little bit more volume on them on this day so that they can see where it actually gets sore. So the next day they go, okay, dumbbell flies may be sore in this area, the outside of the pec, say. Is that a good way then to use your feelings in deciding what exercises to do, how effective exercises are? So you're not focusing on the momentary feeling of, maybe this active insufficiency or maybe getting under this huge stretch. You're not using those while in the gym. Yes, you're feeling the muscle, but you're not going, it's really intense because of this. Are you allowed to use your feelings the next day? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so yes and no, and that's kind of the point of this podcast, is to show you when your feelings are not reliable, which is a lot of the time. So that requires a little bit more nuance again, because essentially, like what you're talking about there is the sensation of, or experience of, delayed onset muscle soreness. So if you're experiencing delayed onset muscle soreness, generally that tends to be associated more so with exercises that are going to be taking you into the lengthened range with sufficient resistance. Okay, so generally that's going to be the case. So like in that case, you could have a very effective exercise that doesn't make you sore, and you could have a less effective exercise that does make you sore, depending on the novelty. So whether or not that was a new exercise, and also depending on the amount of volume that was allocated to that specific exercise. So like, for example, if you do a cable fly, let's say, where it's really difficult in that kind of shortened position where your arms are together, you're in that kind of hugging position. If it's really difficult there versus something like a dumbbell fly where it's really difficult at the bottom, we would expect more soreness from the dumbbell fly. And the problem with that is, like, yeah, that's something that we would expect, but it's not necessarily reliable from the perspective of actually choosing that as your exercise going forward. So I think when you're thinking about like what you feel the next day after exercise, I think there should be a case of you experience some soreness at some points in time if you are choosing appropriate exercises. Like if your quads have never been sore from any of your quad workouts, then I would question, like, one, are you choosing appropriate exercises? Like realistically, if you're doing like a squat variation and a leg press variation, your quads should be working pretty hard, or squat or leg press even. They should be working pretty hard. So then it might be a case of you actually questioning the amount of volume that you're doing. So are you doing actually sufficient sets, or are you working close enough to failure for you to get the stimulus that's required for you at that point in time? So sometimes you do want to experience some soreness, with the caveat that that's not necessarily a marker that you want to look for all the time. But if you've never been sore in a muscle group, then I would be questioning the way in which you perform that exercise, the exercises you're choosing, or the actual dosing of the exercise, as I just said. But that kind of brings us back to a previous point, that we were talking about. We were talking about, what were we saying? The feelings, exercise. Oh yeah, this whole like judging how an exercise actually feels. It matters far more, or almost only matters for exercises that where you're trying to isolate a specific muscle group. Okay, it matters way more when you're trying to isolate something that could potentially be taken over by something else. For example, if you're trying to work, let's say, your rear delts, like you have a really specific goal, those rear delt fibers are really meaningful to you, then you probably do want to find some exercise that you feel those working, because it could be the case that they've underdeveloped throughout your training. So as a result, when you do normal rowing variations or you do wide grip rowing variations, your traps and your lats tend to kind of do most of the work. So in that case, that's where you might want to say, do you know what? I actually want to find a variation where I feel that a little bit more. Similarly, it could be something like your upper chest fibers, like maybe you're a bodybuilder and you really like need to specifically hit that area. Then that's a case where you're like, all right, I want to find an exercise where I feel it more in the upper chest, because at the moment I'm feeling like my delts are doing all the work. So that's kind of where this becomes important. It's more important on that isolated, like real specific basis than it is for 90% of gym goers. Like realistically, if you're doing a squat and it looks technically decent, you're doing a deadlift that looks technically decent, same with some sort of like pressing variation, pulling variations, like if they look okay, then the muscles that are responsible like for moving the weight in those exercises are working. Like if they weren't, you wouldn't be able to do the exercise. And like there's obviously some more nuance there. Like some people are going to have more, glutes working, some people have more quads working in different exercises, and that's totally normal. But realistically, this is more important for those kind of isolated examples than anything else. I wouldn't be stressing too much if I was the average gym goer in terms of like, oh, I don't feel my quads working in the squat. Like if you're progressing over time, you're doing sufficient volume, your quads are probably going to grow most of the time, unless you're like doing a total like good morning with your squat.
Yeah, that's more so where I would use feelings. I would use the feelings in making sure as best you can that you're not using other muscle groups. And again, like the squat is a good one there, where you're like, if you're doing a squat variation and the only thing you can feel is your lower back, right? And that doesn't mean that your quads aren't working. That doesn't mean that your glutes aren't working or whatever. That means that you should probably change your technique in some manner so that you're not just getting this complete overload on like your lower back structures, right? And again, like that's a hard thing to truly go down the rabbit hole with, because some structures aren't going to be able to handle as much volume, as much load as whatever else. So there's always going to be this weak point. So you could be getting sufficient volume, tension, whatever else on your quads, your glutes, your hamstrings, everything else, but your lower back is just taking a bit more of a beating from the exercise, or maybe your glutes are just taking a little bit more. The tension is biased a little bit more towards them. That doesn't, like Gary was saying, that doesn't mean that those other muscles aren't being used, they aren't doing their job. So that's a fine line, but it is the other area. So you can obviously use your feelings to go, okay, I need to bias so that it's only on this muscle. Again, like you said with the rear delts. But to do that, you have to bias it away from being on other muscles, if that makes sense. So you can use your feelings that way. So if you're doing a rear delt variation and you're going, I'm only feeling this in my traps, you can use that feeling of, I'm feeling this only in my traps, to find a variation where you're not feeling it only in your traps, if that makes sense. So you can use your feelings those two ways. You can use it to really isolate in and I just want to feel this very particular section of a muscle, all right? Or you can use it and go, I shouldn't be using my traps in this exercise. So can I change my technique so that my traps don't feel like they're taking over the entire exercise, So even they're essentially just two sides of the same coin, but you can kind of think of them in both of those manners. Make sense, Gary?
Yeah, like, and I mean, like, I'm kind of hesitant as well to push people like down that path of like really trying to like make sure that you feel those rear delts, because I know I've gone far too far with that stuff in the past in terms of like for example, if you're doing a lateral raise and you feel your traps work, like it's almost like a fitness industry norm to just be like, oh God, like, why are your traps working? Like, this isn't a trap exercise. And it's like, it's fine. Like, if your traps are working, like, that's fine. I think people sometimes have this idea that there are certain bad muscles that we don't necessarily want to feel. The traps in a lateral raise is one example. Traps in an upright row, traps in any sort of row, because upper traps are just seen like as a bad muscle. I blame physios for that. That's not a personal trainer's fault. The same thing when it comes to like hip flexors. Like if you're doing a lunge, for example, a lunge or a split squat variation, then like one of the things that people freak out about is like, oh, I feel my hip flexors working. And it's like, oh yeah, that's cool. They're supposed to be working. They're part of the exercise. That's totally fine. However, like, again, hip flexors, like upper traps, are considered to be bad muscles, and people freak out if they feel the hip flexors working. So I suppose like that's why it's important when you're thinking of these exercises, especially when they involve multiple joints, multiple muscles, as most exercises do. You don't want to get like too like freaked out about a specific muscle, because like it is also the case that like when you're a beginner, you're going to feel all sorts of things everywhere that you don't know how to interpret, and that are unreliable if you were to try and interpret them. And one of the ways I've changed over the years personally when I'm advising people about training is to get them to focus on less as opposed to more. Okay, so if they're doing like an exercise and it looks fine, I'm not going to be going in there questioning like, do you feel it here? Do you feel it here? Oh, you shouldn't feel it here, because then that's giving the person lots of stuff to think about that can potentially like just distract them from what's actually important. So I think that's definitely worth considering in this picture as well.
That's very fair, Gary. So to go back to the original point, mobility. So we understand we're not using we're not using our feelings during an exercise or whatever to fully dictate that exercise selection, effectiveness, blah blah blah. Everything we just covered. How does this apply to mobility again?
The main way I was applying it to mobility was basically because it's kind of like mobility gurus like promoting, because it's essentially taking people who are involved in strength training and trying to find some way to show them that they're weak and then get them to practice that more. And the reason that I think that this is an important thing to draw on is because a lot of the time these exercises, there's very little return on investment. And that's kind of the problem, is that like you can take someone and give them a program that puts all of their joints in really awkward positions that are going to feel horrible, they're going to feel really intense, and get them to work in those positions. But the question you actually have to ask yourself is like, what is the return on investment here? Because like we know that like I think it's less than 30% of people actually meet their basic exercise guidelines for health. Like that's just health. Like that's not performance or anything. So if we know that percentage of people may meet the basic guidelines for health, we have to be really careful when trying to get them to do loads of other things to take time away from things like strength training that builds strength and muscle and prolongs their life and increases quality of life and function, etc. And their basic aerobic exercise that again is going to, prolong their life, reduce incidence of cardiovascular disease, etc., etc. So they're the really important things. And to me, when you're justifying an intervention that is additive to that, like it better be damn good. And a lot of the time, putting joints in awkward positions just to hold them kind of for the sake of it, I question the return on investment. And this isn't just a case of like you and me like looking from the outset and being like, oh, that's stupid because we don't do it. Like both of us are literally qualified in this stuff. Like we traveled all the way to Switzerland and paid like thousands and everything to get certified in this stuff. So like it's not a case of just
I'm also
ignorance.
Qualified yoga
and you've been doing this stuff for like a decade.
Oh, literally, like I've done all this stuff. I've gone down all of these rabbit holes. Like I really enjoy some of those training modalities. And I enjoy.
Yeah, that's cool.
Like I like exercising. I like moving. I'm like, if I'm sitting down, I'm like, yeah, I can do some fucking rotations with my hip or something. I'm like, it gives me something to do. Like, So that's the perspective we're coming from. But again, like you said, I always question the return on investment, because people make out this mobility stuff to be, I don't know, fucking a godsend or something. Like it's like this, if you're not doing this, like you basically are going to get body cancer. Your entire body is just going to be cancer. It's like you're useless as a being. You can't move, and it's like, okay, that to an extent is fair, because what it means to be human is to be able to move, like even if it's just on a cellular level, like that's what our cells need to do, you know. So that's cool. I can kind of get down with this, but then if you're saying that, I'm going to expect that you spending these 4, 5, 6, 20 hours per week doing your hip mobilization stuff, I'm going to presume you squat like 400 kilos.
Yep.
Like that's
run marathons regularly.
exactly that's my baseline presumption. Like if you've spent all this time getting this last millimeter of range of motion in your hip, I'm going to presume that was worth 1,000-fold increase in your strength levels, your ability, your capacity to move. But if it isn't, then why did you do it? Now that's, of course, I don't want to just be a complete like straw man in the argument, because
yeah.
At the same time, it's like, that's not to say mobility work isn't vital in some cases. Like say, for example, like you're doing a load of jits these days that you're just not accustomed to because you're quite weak, both in the mind and the body. But anyway, and you know, like in like say in jits, like there's loads of positions where you're going to have to bring your knee towards your chest. Say you're shrimping out, you're bridging out of a position, and you're trying to bring your knee to your chest. Like if you don't have the mobility to bring that knee in towards the chest, or get into a good kind of, we'll say that kind of shrimped out position, you're not going to be able to be successful at your chosen sport, you know? And that's the way you should think of these things. Like, is there a mobility limitation that is holding you back? If there is, then yeah, by all means, you should be working on it. If you are just trying to move a little bit better, trying to get stronger, get fitter, there's probably 1 or 2 things that you're like, yeah, I probably should spend a little bit more time working on that. But that doesn't mean that you have to do these specific mobility drills. That could just mean that, okay, when I do my squat, I'm actually going to pause it in that bottom position for a couple of seconds, just to really open up, like feeling it around, actually get a little bit stronger in that position. It doesn't have to take this 20, 30 minute mobilization drills before your workout or anything like that. Like, again, I've gone down this rabbit hole. I'm like, yeah, that's what you need to do. You need to do 20 minutes of mobilizing, some foam rolling, whatever else before your workouts. But what's the return on investment? Like, I also always look at these people, and then I'm like, okay, cool. So if you're spending this 20, 30, 40, 50, some people spend an hour before their workout, you know, mobilizing. I'm going to presume that you have unreal mobility after 6 months, a year, right? I'm going to presume you're going to be able to do the splits. I'm going to presume you're going to be able to do all of these wild movements. Because if you were to train for a year and you weren't able to squat the bar, or you weren't able to squat like a plate as a guy, like a plate per side, I'd be questioning your training modality. So if you're just going, oh yeah, just do these mobilization exercises, and after a year you have literally nothing to show for it, and again, I'm being a bit of a straw man, I'm strawmanning the argument somewhat by saying, oh, you should have the splits, but you should have some, you know, something to show for all of that time you've invested, you know, rather than just, oh well, it felt good, it felt like I was stretching my hip flexor. What?
Yeah, and like as we've discussed so many times, anytime this mobility like discussion has come up, like the definition of mobility is the ability to move. And what is resistance training? It's training your ability to move, except with actual resistance. Like, you know, like you were talking about there, the shrimp position in BJJ. Like if you want to get into that position, it's like, what does that look like? It's like, oh, it almost looks like the bottom of a deadlift almost, or even the bottom of a squat. Like if you're squatting deep enough. So it's like, maybe I should practice that stuff so that I can actually produce force there as well. I'm not just, you know, trying to get there with no resistance, because I'm going to have this like 100-kilo guy on top of me who wants to kill me as well. So I'm like, I may as well practice with weights. So that's where like, you know, this mobility stuff comes back into the real world. It's like it's about the ability to move, and if we want to train our ability to move, then we have to do so in a way that is genuinely challenging and that actually replicates kind of the real world, I guess. So that's running, that's mountain running, that's going and lifting weights, that's going to jiu-jitsu or whatever you prefer to do. It's like you're training your ability to move there, but you're actually deciding, all right, what's the end point for me? Like, what do I want to be able to do? And then I go and I practice that stuff. Because, you know, even if you give that example, like jiu-jitsu, it's like, if you wanted to get better at jiu-jitsu, you're not going to do like 4 days of mobility work and 1 day of jiu-jitsu. It's like, no, it's going to be the opposite way around. Like you actually practice what you need to be able to do, because there's a lot more to it. And that's the same with any sport. So I think we've covered the mobility stuff. Hopefully that gives you guys some things to think about, because I definitely see like a lot of people putting out a lot of information about this stuff, especially because I kind of, you know, have my hand in that sort of physio world as well, and definitely see like that being like the focal point for a lot of physios is like, oh, you just need to work on your mobility, you know, you just need to work on your mobility. And until we have like clear definitions about what that actually means, what adaptations you're looking for, and what the return on investment is, I think it's a relatively worthless discussion, because we know that low muscle strength and low muscle mass are negative predictors for like mortality and quality of life and stuff. So it's like, all right, why are you not trying to actually get stronger and build muscle and increase your, you know, cardiorespiratory capacity? That's the important stuff. And like, whether you have 40 degrees or 43 degrees of hip external rotation, I'm like, meh, not particularly important for me if you don't have muscle around that joint to support it in 60 years. So there you go. And that kind of brings us on to the final part of this discussion, which I think also warrants its own podcast at some point. We have touched on it in the past, but it's the idea that you try and qualify, you know, how difficult your workout was by the feeling of one single set. And we've talked about this before, but it basically, you can reduce it down to the idea of training to total failure and quote unquote beyond failure, or leaving some reps in the tank. Because like there is, like, it's obviously very popular in especially now that people have the opportunity to share training videos online to everyone all the time. You want to make it look like you are crushing it, you know, you want to be going beast mode. And, you know, people always put up videos of themselves like going to failure and like nearly getting sick after a single set and stuff like that. And I suppose the people we are trying to speak to are the people that are observing that and thinking, oh God, maybe I need to train harder. You know, should I really be leaving 2 reps in the tank or whatever? Like, is this a good idea? And I suppose what I want to get people to realize is that how difficult a set feels is not a reliable indicator of future outcomes. And I think a really good way of understanding that is looking at how other athletes actually train. Because I think sometimes we keep our eyes so focused on people who lift weights that we forget to look elsewhere. And if you ask any marathon runner how they train most of the time, they'll be doing lots of tempo work, you know, so they'll be doing things like, you know, reducing the pace at which they run their kilometers, but much like below the threshold that they'd run in an actual marathon, because they don't want to be doing this constant, like maximally fatiguing work, because that's just generally not a good idea in terms of like recovering, you know, reducing risk of injury and stuff like that. You don't want to be going 100% all of the time. What they might do then is include some like intervals where they actually work at their race pace, and they build that up over time. And it's no different when it comes to like sports teams. If you play GA, like if you have a good coach, they're not going to have you like out working like 100% effort all of the time. Like, that's just generally not a good way of going about things. And that comes back to weight training as well. If you're doing all of your...
Before you go ahead. That, like going with the running stuff as well, like as everyone always likes to do it, even though it's a false dichotomy, people always like to compare like resistance training to sprinting. They're like, oh, they're both anaerobic. I'm like, okay, so if you're going to suggest that, then surely you would then suggest training the way a sprinter would train, which would be not maximally. Sprinter's not going, I'm going to work up to my absolute, like Usain Bolt's not going in there and trying to beat 9 seconds every single 100 meter he does. Like, he's like, okay, I'm going to take it at a certain pace. I'm going to build up the intensity of that over weeks, months, years more likely. Like, he's not going balls to the wall 10 out of 10 every single 100 meter. And then people will be like, oh yeah, well, it's not resistance training. It isn't like sprinting then. It's like, okay, well, like, is it like it or is it not like it? You know, you have to be somewhat consistent in your, if you're saying it uses the same energy systems, then why would you train it differently? Anyway, that's just my little aside.
Yeah, but I mean, like, it applies to everything. Like, literally every sport, except people that just go to the gym themselves. People are concerned about pulling back a little bit, like not going 100% all the time. That's why you'll see runners like tracking their heart rate when they run, because they're like, oh, I want to make sure, I'm not going above, let's say, 70-80% of my max heart rate, because I know then that I'll just get really fatigued, burn out really soon, and then I won't be able to do my workout that I need to do tomorrow or the day after. So every sport. However, when it comes to resistance training, weight training, powerlifting, bodybuilding, whatever, there's that sort of, I guess, card that people wear where, like, oh no, I go all the way to failure all the time. And again, like, I've been there. I have been that person. I've been that person who's like, you grunt your way all the way to the end of the set, and you pause for a few seconds and you're dying and you're like, no, bro, I've got like 10 more, and you just keep going. So I've been there, and that definitely has its place at times. But essentially what you're doing there is you're taking a single set and you're pouring all of your efforts into that, instead of thinking, all right, what about my performance on subsequent sets? So if I'm doing 4 sets, I want to be able to perform well throughout all of those. And then I want to be able to do the exercise after that. And I want to be able to do my workout tomorrow and my workout next week. So you start to take that longer term perspective, and don't just focus on how a single set was, because you do see this all the time where people are in the gym and they work up to one single set where it's really difficult. They empty the tank, and then they're like, oh, I actually mightn't do my back off set because that set went really well, because they start to like invest all of their efforts into that and think that that's all that matters. Because I think people have a skewed idea of what progressive overload should look like. They think that they need to hit PRs every session, and once you do that, you're making progress. Whereas progressive overload is just part of the picture. You also need to be doing, sufficient volume, and you need to be able to sustain that over time then. So it's a longer term thing. And you also see this when people do like leg workouts, for example. Let's say people will go beast mode on their squats, then their kind of RDLs or whatever they might be doing next, it's like, oh yeah, I'm kind of putting effort in. I kind of half-ass my lunges, and then I obviously skip calves. Like, why would I do calves, And that's because people are totally emptying themselves into single sets or even single exercises and not conserving their energy throughout the workout. So I wouldn't just rely on how difficult a single set was. You can't just keep working harder as a means of trying to progress. Like, that's not sustainable or useful. Like what do? You just reach a point where you've hit failure, and you just keep going to failure every week. Like, you can't just keep doing that, because it's just not a useful practice, and you're not allowing yourself to perform across multiple sets, which is probably a better thing to focus on.
Yeah, just two things throughout that conversation as well. Like, we should also compare all this stuff to the sport of actually lifting weights, which there's 2 lifting weight sports. There's like Olympic weightlifting and there's powerlifting, and neither of them go to failure. Like, they're literally more concerned with, I'm going to practice my technique, I'm going to lift submaximally, I'm going to make every rep as beautiful as possible. And even the like West Side barbell, because they'd be the ones that are more traditionally like, let's go balls to the wall. But the way it looks, like, obviously I've never been to West Side barbell, so I don't fucking know. I'm not Louis Simmons, quite clearly.
Are you not?
Oh Jesus. But by the looks of it, they're not going to absolute complete failure on their max effort sets. Like, yes, they're going to pretty fucking damn hard, but they're not in the gym every single week trying to, well, they are trying to hit PRs, but they're not doing the same exercise and trying to add 1.25 kilos to the max out, like 1 rep max they did last week. Like, that's not what they're doing. That's why they rotate exercises. That's why they do that kind of stuff. So they're like, yes, we can work hard, but we're working hard in multiple rep ranges. We're working hard on multiple exercises. We're working hard across multiple different variables, and that kind of gets lost in the conversation. And again, with the Olympic lifters, like, they're just not. The only ones that would be more so towards that kind of max effort, like all out, would be the previous Bulgarian lifters. But again, like, they were all on drugs, so there's that. They were also like selected to be able to survive that training, and most of them wouldn't be lifting maximally every single day. Like you can literally look at the people who were engaged in that training, and they used to always say, there's a term for it, I can't remember, and they used to always talk about how they used to go about 20% under what they knew they were able for on a consistent basis, and like lie about it and say, oh, I misloaded the weights, or, you know, just be like, oh, I'm feeling a little bit sick today, or whatever. Like they would always try to cheat the system, because even then, being the genetic elite, being them on drugs, still realize that this is pretty fucking hard to max effort, like truly all the time, you know? And again, that's not to say it can't be done. It's just that it's probably not appropriate. Then the other ones that do it are the Chinese, but again, they are genetically selected. They're probably fucking genetically engineered, realistically. But they're genetically selected. Like the way they have their system run up, or the way they have their system run, is like they literally have schools and they'll pick you from like a child.
Yeah.
Like you have the correct genetics for whatever sport it is that we're trying to do. In this case, Olympic lifting, and be like, you are perfectly suited for this. And then they'll build up the volume. Like they literally do like 5 years of just using like a broom, you know, to do the exercise. So it's like they've already got like before you even knew what weights were, they were squatting 100 kilos because they had literally spent fucking the last 10 years before that practicing the technique, getting all this foundational stuff done, you know? So you can't really compare yourself to them either. And then everyone else that would be in the same position as, you know, the people going to the gym aren't maxing out, aren't going balls to the wall 10 out of 10. Right? So that's one part of my response there we should have mentioned as well. But then also to that, well, all these people that are going fucking balls to the wall with their leg training, maybe it's just me, but I would think it is way more impressive if you just stepped off this fucking 50 rep fucking, not even a Widowmaker, this fucking Deathmaker set, and you were just like, whew, yeah, that was a good challenge. It was grand. And like you're dying, literally like dying on the inside, like you didn't even express a single iota of pain in your face. I think that'd be more impressive, surely.
100%. And like that actually touches on a really important point that I almost forgot to bring up, but it was in relation to fatigue. Like, you know, fatigue is like pain and like all these things we talk about. They're kind of like these it's a multifactorial experience. So it's all these different inputs are coming together to determine how fatigued you feel after a set. So if you're like grunting, shouting, everyone's shouting at you, you've got your loudest rock music on and you're going all the way to the end on that multi-joint exercise, if you're doing that, like that is super fatiguing and disproportionately fatiguing versus you adopting that attitude, like you just said, is like, I'm just going to be calm. I'm going to push myself to the point where I'm done. I'm listening to some Bach in my ears, you know, that's all I'm listening to. And then you finish your set and you're like, oh, that was nice. It was too easy, you know. You finish that and like that's going to result in less fatigue because you're not.
Pish posh, chaps. It was grand.
Yeah, because you're not hyping yourself up. Like, you know, if people are going to talk about like the stress response and the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system and all that, like think about what that actually means for your training. Like, you don't want to like be totally ramping yourself up and getting as stressed as you possibly could on every set, because that's leading to disproportionate amounts of fatigue that you then have to like recover from before you can perform again. So if you're doing like set 1 and you're getting 12 reps and then you could only get 6 on set 2, it's like, damn, like that's a lot of fatigue, and you could have potentially just did 8 to 10 across 4 sets there and accumulated a lot more work in total. So they're the kind of things that are worth thinking about.
Okay, so anything else about feelings, Gary?
I was going to put on my control your emotions hat just for the episode, but I didn't put it on. But anyway, there you go. Like, yeah, basically, like that's kind of the message is like, if you're training in the gym, resistance training, like it's probably a good idea to try and control your emotions sometimes. You know, that you want to not allow yourself to get to that point where you've totally given 100%. You leave a little bit in the tank. We've talked about that on previous podcasts in relation to reps and reserve and stuff like that. That's generally a good idea. Then when it comes to actual exercise selection, you're thinking about, you know, so you want your feelings to be you want to rely on them a little bit, especially if there's those types of specific isolation exercises that have a very specific purpose. But in a broader sense, for most resistance training exercises like compound multi-joint movements, then you're thinking, all right, my feelings are probably less reliable here because the chances are these muscles are probably working once my technique is somewhat decent. And then finally, when it comes to the mobility stuff that we touched on, despite the fact that some of these exercises may feel really difficult, you have to ask yourself if the return on investment is actually worth it, because very often you might find that that's actually not the case, with the caveat that we're not saying that they're stupid and irrelevant, and we already kind of made that case that there is some application there for sure. So yeah, is that a sufficient summary? We are going to do some Q&A as well, so if you want to add anything, I'll load up the questions.
I want to add nothing, Gary. Absolutely nothing. But I
Too
will.
easy. So
that is a free article, isn't it? The misapplication of feelings. Is that a free article?
Yes. Well, there's an article on our site on that.
I will link it in the description.
Savage. Yeah, because that actually goes into a little bit more of the, if I recall correctly, the physiology of what's actually going on here. And I think in that article I also talk about things like, sweating and like how red you look during exercise, like stuff like that as well, because I think that's actually relevant as well to beginners who think that they need to be sweating and out of breath all the time when that's not necessarily the goal. So yeah, check that out as well. So basically what we're going to do in the podcast going forward, guys, is take maybe like 3 to 5 of your questions at the end, so that we can kind of keep you engaged and make sure we're giving you information that's actually useful. So I've got some of them loaded up here. And the first one from Tom, do you think these should be anonymous? Or I can say first name, surely, like who cares?
I think it should be anonymous. Just make up a name.
I'll be anonymous, so all right. But if you're listening, which question is yours, surely.
Cool.
Tom asked, do you think you should have a base level of muscle mass before cutting? I'll take this quickly and then you can add anything else. I think yes and no. Yes, in a sense that if you are that kind of beginner skinny guy or girl who's getting into this to look like your idol from Instagram who's ripped and who's been doing this for like 10 years, then there's definitely a certain level that you need to get to in terms of muscle mass before you consider cutting to try and reach that goal, like for sure. But that sort of assumes that we're starting from that starting point of this person is in the fitness industry, they want to look like this person at the end point, and that's definitely not everyone. And I think the broader answer would be that no, like there's no base level of muscle mass that you need to have to cut, because, for example, you could have a low level of muscle mass and lots of body fat, and it could be very helpful for you to try and lose that body fat like straight out of the gate. Like that would be a good idea. Like if you've got a 42-inch waist as a male, like you want to get that down for sure. So that's why there would be a no in this case. But I would also add that if you are that person who's a higher level of body fat and you need to cut down, you can still start to gain muscle and strength along the way, like once your nutrition is set up well with sufficient protein. So yeah, the answer is yes and no. It's definitely not clear cut, because most of us don't really know how to measure our muscle mass. Most people do it subjectively. No one's going and getting a DEXA scan, and there's no specific gold standard of an actual level. But generally, you want to have more muscle mass in the long term, but you also don't want to be excessively fat. So kind of weigh up those things as you will.
Yeah, I agree. I think once you're in the quote unquote healthy body fat ranges for a male, we'll arbitrarily, like we go into it on the site a bit more, but we'll say 10 to 15%, somewhere in that range is a good healthy range for males. And we'll say that 17 to 25% for females. Like if you're within that range, then yeah, cool. Just focus on building muscle. But if you're way above those ranges, then yeah, spending a little time dieting, cutting down before you try gaining muscle would probably be a good idea. Again, like losing body fat generally, to an extent, obviously not once you start getting into the lower end of things, generally correlates with better health. So I would bias health over aesthetics, but again, that's just me. Maybe you only care about the aesthetic side of things and you want to bias that more, then yeah, if you want to look like your fitness idol, you're probably going to have to spend more time building muscle. But again, you have to weigh that with the fact that you're probably less effective at building muscle when you are more overweight with body fat, like, so yes and no, like Gary said, like it just depends. For most people, I would say get into that healthy body fat range and then try to build muscle while you stay in that body fat range until you're happy with roughly where you're at. And then, maybe periodically you do a few diets, lose a little bit of body fat, gain it again, lose it, gain it again, until you're like, yeah, cool, I actually weigh 140 kilos shredded.
Yeah, and I think as well, like any time the body fat percentage discussion, like you just said there, kind of comes up, people get really annoyed because they're like, oh, what do you mean I'm not healthy if I'm 10 to 15% body fat? It's like, no, like that's not what Paddy's saying. Is like, if you are 18% body fat, you could be super healthy. It would depend on, how active you are, your other lifestyle factors. It would depend on, like, do you store more body fat around, like, centrally around your abdomen? That's generally worse for health than storing it elsewhere. And it's also the case that we're talking here about someone who's going to gain weight. Like if you let's say are 19-20% body fat and you also like have a 36-inch waist as the male, and you're kind of moving towards the point where there might be certain cardiometabolic like risk factors there as a result of your level of fatness, then we're not going to say, oh yeah, just go ahead and go and gain weight. Like, so it might just be the case that you might be in a good place, but you don't just want to keep trying to gain weight just for the sake of it. So that's,
yeah, like they are somewhat arbitrary standards. Like obviously they are scientifically backed, whatever the fuck you want to call them. But like there's a reason. It's like, yeah, with higher body fat, you have these associated things. People with lower body fat tend to have these associated things. And people who fall into this range of body fat generally tend to have these healthier habits. So again, like you said, Gary, lifestyle factors, et cetera. But yeah, for in and around those ranges tend to be good for health. Like anyone that I've seen the blood work of, anyone that I've coached generally seems to be in a good place as a male in that 10 to 15%, as a female in that kind of 15, 17. Some people can get lower and still be fine. Generally women tend to not do as well once they get below that kind of 15%. And again, that's on like a DEXA scan, so take that for what you will. And then again, once they get over that kind of 24-25% body fat, it's like, yeah, like you can still obviously be healthy. Like that, you could be healthy at higher body fat, like way higher, like up to like 40%. It's just,
yeah,
you're probably not in the peak optimal health that you could be. Like you're not looking at one factor that contributes to your health. Like you have health gains on the table, if that makes sense. Like,
yeah, and like we discussed that in the Facebook group as well, about that kind of like, some people make the argument that you can be totally metabolically healthy and be obese, and it's like, yeah, you can for sure, and you see that like at the beginning when people start to nudge into that category of obese, and they might be metabolically healthy at one point in time, but when you actually follow them longitudinally over a period of like 5 to 10 years, what you see in the research is that people continuously start to drop into that like state of metabolic ill health and more risk factors over time. So it's not a simple question. And I think you can go into the research and find like whatever bias you want here, but when you actually look at it over time, it's like, okay, yeah, obesity, like it's probably not sound for health. Like I think we could agree on that. But there you go. The next question was from Ali, who asked, do you think PTs need a niche, i.e. specific topic or area that they are specialists in, or be generalists? Paddy, what do you think? We're generalists, like, so.
It depends on what you want to do with your business, with your whatever. Like if there's a certain clientele, the way, if I was doing it, the way I would look to secure clientele or whatever is look at who can you help the most. Not necessarily who do you want to help the most, but with your current knowledge, with your current and potential future desires, like what you'd like to study, that kind of stuff, who can you help the most? That might be, I don't know, 40-year-old mothers. It might be business executives, like whoever it is. Who can you help the most? You can niche down into that, but generally speaking, like if you're a personal trainer, even if you're a strength coach, whatever, like being a generalist will give you more opportunity for business. So there's that. So again, it depends. Most people are going to start off as generalists in the PT industry. However, most people in the PT industry leave within 3 to 5 years. So
3 to 5.
Maybe that's a bad thing, you know? So yeah, there's no easy answer to it. Like personally, I would be just looking at who can I help the most. Like even though we're generalists, like we still, when clients come to us, like when they apply online or whatever, it's like we still have like a questionnaire and stuff. We usually do a bit of back and forth via email, and it'll be like, if they are maybe injured or they have certain issues, you might be like, okay, well, Gary, you're better suited to help this person, or I have other things that I'm better suited to help. So it's like that then generally, even though we're generalists, we are still niche down, if that makes sense. So yeah.
Yeah. And I think it is kind of useful to start off. Like when you're starting off, you can't just pretend to be a specialist. You know, you do see people do that, and they're like, you know, they've just gotten into the industry, and they're like, I'm a strength coach. Like I just coach elite powerlifters, and it's like, wait, what? Like, firstly, you're not a powerlifter, and secondly, like you haven't coached any. So I think you do have to kind of try and get like generalist experience, and that's no different to like any other education you would get. Like if you're going to study to be like a doctor or any healthcare professional, you're going to work in lots of different areas, you know, within the hospital, within the community. You're going to do a little bit of cardiology, a little bit of neurology, etc., because you want to get that general knowledge base before you specify too much. So there you go. But like, I get why you're asking that, Ollie, because I think if you seek out like help from any of the kind of fitness business gurus or go on any fitness business courses, the first thing they tell you is to find your specific niche and to specialize as soon as possible. However, like as a trainer in your young 20s, I'm like, you've got plenty of time to do that. You know, get a generalist knowledge base first, because very often what you'll find is that the people giving that advice to specialize, they were also generalists early on, and they had success then when they specialized. But was that just because they had the generalist base? And I think it does play into that to some extent. Perfect. So the next question was advice for training someone terrified of injuring their back. Even bodyweight squats cause pain. Like my knee-jerk response to this is to give a real simple answer, but I'm very mindful that I obviously have very clear biases because I've had the opportunity to work like on placement, like clinically within the hospital and with actual individuals, and give them this advice in a setting where they actually were injured. Like, you know, so it's a different story when I give this answer. But what I would say is that most of the time, in the majority of cases of back pain, people are totally okay to train. But the problem is that you have to have the education and the knowledge to be able to reassure that person. And I think sometimes people want to be able to reassure people without actually being like totally reassured themselves first. So step one is for you, the personal trainer, to feel totally comfortable yourself training when you have some back pain. Like, are you comfortable doing that? And then why? Like, understand why. Like, what is it about back pain that would or wouldn't make it good to train with? And if you can understand it for yourself, you'll then be able to advise others. Because what's going to happen is you're going to say to your client, oh, I've been doing some reading about back pain and reached out to people who know a little bit about back pain. And they told me that, you know, it's totally okay to train when you've got back pain. You're probably going to be fine. Most people experience this. And then what they're going to say is, oh yeah, but I had this MRI 2 years ago and they found that I have degenerative disc disease. And they also found that I've got, you know, bulging disc at L3, L4. And you as the trainer are going to be like, oh shit. Because firstly, you're not totally sure of what maybe the prevalence of those things are in asymptomatic populations. And secondly, you're not totally sure where this lies in your scope of practice in terms of giving advice. So that's why I would kind of be saying to you to maybe go away, try and understand some of that stuff first. Listen to the podcast that we did with Mary O'Keefe, Dr. Mary O'Keefe, a couple of weeks ago. That'd be worth listening to, and kind of start there and read further from that. I'm also putting together a resource at the moment kind of dedicated towards like personal trainers and trainees. That's basically going to be like your foundations of like pain and dealing with people who are injured, because realistically a lot of your clients as a trainer, they're going to have pain every now and then, and I think being able to reassure them is really useful. So look out for that over the summer.
Yeah, 100%.
Anything to add, Paddy?
On that, all look look to, coming from the perspective that obviously I'm not in the healthcare industry like you are, like especially in that branch of the healthcare industry like you are, or at least like you're qualified in, or well, I presume you've passed this year, like you're pretty awkward. But yeah, coming from my perspective, all I would try to do is stay within exercises that the client feels comfortable with, that you feel comfortable with. Like coaching, like you said, like you're going to be like, oh shit, like this bull, like they have this, the doctors have said this, or I don't know, you know. So you are going to feel like that. So do stuff that you are comfortable with, that you're confident with, you know. Teach that confidence to the client, and then just look to build on that over time. Like I have loads of clients that have experienced back pain in the past, have experienced, you know, like proper, I'm saying back pain is not a proper, but a proper injuries. And it's like, you just need to build confidence over time. Like, yes, obviously getting stronger is a part of that, but that doesn't mean that it has to be like, oh yeah, I know fucking Sheila, you have a back pain, you have this degenerative disc disease as shown by an MRI and bulging discs here and wherever else. But yeah, just get under the squat rack. Like that's not, I don't mean that in terms of getting stronger. It's like, okay, can we do some leg extensions? Like let's get you feeling confident, you know, actually using your musculature system, like as a whole. Like let's actually just use it. Let's just go, okay, what can you do, Sheila? Let's see. Okay, you can squat body weight. Okay, cool. You can squat, you know, with a ball on your back, like a wall ball squat. What can you do? All I want to do is get you moving, and then over time progress that in a safe, confident, controlled manner, and then essentially teach that client that they are not fragile, that they are not weak, and that they are actually a capable human being. And like that could be as simple as picking stuff off the ground. And I don't even mean deadlifting. Like that could literally be you as a personal trainer getting a few of those, like, you know, throwaway kind of cone things that they use in like football training and stuff. And literally being like, right, Sheila, I know you say that you don't feel confident picking things off the ground because you feel like you're going to snap your shit. So today we're going to slowly start bringing these things where you pick them off of like using like boxes and stuff. And like, right, can you pick it off that? Yes, you feel comfortable with that. Let's see your technique. Assess your technique on that. Okay, look, you're in a safe environment. You're in this. Let's see if we can bring this down. And again, bring it all the way down to the floor. Oh, look at this, Sheila. You can actually pick things off the floor. You didn't get injured. Let's start bringing these that they're slightly heavier. There's a 1 kg dumbbell. Can you pick that off the floor? Oh, look, you didn't injure yourself. That's it for today. Next week, let's see if we can do 2 kgs. You know, and like just progress it like that. Show them that they're resilient. Show them that you for one are confident in their ability, and then show them that they can be confident in their ability, and then just progress it from there. Like strength comes in many forms, and it is specific to the task. So if they're coming to you and they want to lose weight, tone up, feel confident, be strong, you as an individual are just there to show them a path to go about achieving it. But yeah, that's my advice.
And that's the case for people who are in pain or aren't in pain. Like that, like that's the name of the game. Is self-efficacy, is about showing people like what can you actually do. Like I remember I had a guy on one of my placements. He was almost 80. Like, but one of his favorite activities was to go and play golf, like with his friends, and obviously that was the time point for him to engage socially, you know, to not be alone, to be with friends, to do meaningful tasks. As per last week's podcast, you know, all that stuff's really important for health. So that was his opportunity. Whereas what he had done was stopped going to play golf because he was afraid that if he tried to pick up the golf ball, he wouldn't be able to get back up, like that he wouldn't be able to do that anymore. So basically what we did was practice very similar to what you're talking about, Paddy, is like we placed like 1 kilo dumbbells on like a high step to start with. All right, let's see if you can pick those up. Then a lower step, and then eventually the floor. And then, you know, basically delivering that message that, like, you know, if you could pick up that 1 kilo dumbbell, do you think you could pick up a really light golf ball? Do you think you could maybe do that? And then people will tell you themselves that they are more confident in doing something then. And that goes for your client here. You know, if that person is having pain with bodyweight squats, then you just find some way that you can get them to exercise in a way that they're confident to start off with. That could literally be them getting out of the chair. It's like, all right, a full squat, that's too much. Let's see if we can squat up out of a chair. How's that? Oh, that's cool. Let's add a little bit of weight. All right, then let's do a goblet squat, and so on and so on and so on. So that's what it's all about. One final question, because we've been given a good bit of detail here. They're nice. Was what do we do personally to quote unquote optimize sleep? So we touched on this a couple of weeks ago, but what do we do personally? What do you do, Paddy? How do you
I literally
optimize your sleep?
I just close my eyes. Like, I am the worst person for this. I'm going to tell you a story right now, right? I literally will close my eyes, and within maybe 30 seconds to a minute, be in the deepest sleep you could ever imagine, right? Like Gary will tell you, I literally also just stay in the exact same position. Like, I don't move while I'm asleep. Like, if you powered off your computer, that's what it's like. It's like my brain just powered off. Like, I don't move, like nothing, right? I have some pretty fucked up dreams, but I don't move at all, right? Like, all the time as well when I was younger, like my mom used to be able to like wake me up, but I would still be asleep. She'd be like, oh, unplug the plug there. And I would still 100% be asleep. Get out of my bed, unplug the plug, and then get back into my bed. But I'd be asleep. Like, I wouldn't remember it, everything, right? So personally, what I do to optimize my sleep is nothing. However, what I do try to do is not, and this is a huge one, not sleep in a bed with Gary, right? For two reasons, right? First of all, he farts.
Sexual assault.
Farts all the time. Second of all, the last time I was in a bed with him, he sexually assaulted me. So there's that. And to tell you that story, it was actually when we were in Switzerland. My friend set us up, like hooked us up with some pretty fucking sweet digs, like a real nice rooftop. What are those called? Where you got a, whatever the fuck it's called, penthouse.
Balcony.
Penthouse apartment overlooking a lake. It was beautiful, like actually beautiful, right? And then I was like, all right, cool, Gary, we have this thing in the morning. We'll get up, we'll explore the city in the morning. Real nice. I was like, we'll go to bed early, right? There was only one pretty fucking big bed. I was like, this will be fine, So we're in the bed, and literally must have been maybe 1 a.m., right? And Gary just takes my hand and tries to hold my hand in his sleep. Like, he was fully asleep, and I woke up to someone trying to hold my hand. I was like, what the fuck is this? Like, he literally tried to molest me in the night. And then he was like, I can't remember it, was his excuse in the morning. He was like, oh, I do that because I do that with my girlfriend. Yeah. It's like, okay, well, I'm not your girl.
I thought it was your willy.
Yeah, well, it was sick. Don't ever do it again. But yeah, no, to actually answer the question, I do nothing to optimize my sleep. And I realize that I'm in the extreme minority that doesn't need, well, I say it doesn't need to do anything. Like, I literally just close my eyes, fall asleep. And if I need to get up at 6 a.m., I will naturally just wake up at 5:30 a.m.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like for me, I do a couple of things. Some of them are not necessarily deliberate for sleep because they're just good practices. But like, firstly, exercise. Like, just do it. Like, move your body, be active. Like that generally helps sleep. Definitely helps for me. Get out during the day if you can. If you can get out into sunlight, get lots of light exposure, that tends to help. You've probably experienced that yourself, where the sun will be out someday and you're out all day, and then you're just absolutely drained and you sleep like a baby. Other than that, not be on my phone in bed. That's a pretty big one. And like, I don't really do anything else actively. Like, I'm not saying that there's no benefit to doing anything else. It's just that I personally don't. I try not to.
You also don't drink water before going to bed, because you also wake up and need to urinate like you're some 90-year-old man or something.
Yep, that's me.
Whereas again, like, I could literally drink a liter of water before going to bed and I wouldn't wake up because of it. So yeah, that'll show you again. Like, whenever anyone gives advice out in the fitness industry, it is actually something that's really hard to do, because what you're trying to do is give nuanced advice to a broad audience. So like, just think about that. If the two of us, we're just normal people, we're not involved in the fitness industry, say, and we're looking for advice. Like, my time doing all the things, getting these blue light blocking glasses, not drinking water before bed, doing this, like don't look at your phone, like all that kind of stuff, I would literally just be wasting my time. Like I'm sure there would be some maybe measurable potential benefit to me doing that, but by and large, I wouldn't be effectively using my time, and I would just be stressing over minor details for minimal return. Whereas for Gary, some of these things may be way more important, So again, like whenever you're interpreting information that you're given from the fitness industry as a whole, or in general, like you should ask, like, who is this for? And then if you apply that information, you should be in some way tracking how that has actually improved the metrics that you're trying to help, So if you're trying to improve your sleep, like how are you actually quantifying that improved sleep, if that makes sense? Like it shouldn't just be like, oh yeah, I'm trying to improve my sleep and I'm doing all these things, and you're not even doing a more feeling based quantifying it or quantification. Like you're not even doing that. You're just going, oh yeah, like I think these things are improving. You're not waking up and going, okay, how was my sleep? Assessing it. Was it good? Was it bad? How long did I sleep? You're not even doing the more kind of feeling based quantification. You're just going, yeah, I hope it's working.
Yep. And we touched on more of that in the podcast 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, whatever. It's titled Over Medicalization. So it's worth listening to. I think, we're essentially making the case that, yeah, there are more specific things that you could potentially do to improve your sleep, but it just depends on who you are as well. Like maybe it's the case that you generally like eat a massive meal right before bed. Like that's not something I would typically do anyway, but if I do that, it would affect my sleep. So I try not to do that, whereas Paddy, I'm pretty sure you've no problem like slamming just loads of carbs right before bed and it won't affect your sleep. And there you go.
I'm pretty sure I could get shot. I'm pretty sure I could get shot and it wouldn't affect my sleep. I just probably would never wake up. Like
that's weak, man. But yeah, I think that covers all the not all the questions that we have, but we don't want to make this like a 3-hour podcast either. And we'll basically just pick 3 to 5 questions each week. So if you had a question and it didn't get answered, then just ask it next week, and we will get stuck into it. But other than that,
even better than asking it next week, there is a form below linked that you can submit questions, and we will either do a full podcast on them, do an article on them, or we will answer it at the end of the podcast. So if you ask a question and we haven't answered it before, we will answer it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
So do you have anything else to add to this, Gary?
Nothing else to add. No, I just need to have my breakfast. Well, I did have a protein bar, but other than that.
So you already broke your fast, so you're not actually having break fast. Makes sense.
I don't even care about the semantics. I just want a big, tasty meal with loads of eggs.
That's fair enough. Right. I have nothing else to say except that it is quite, in fact, too easy.
Too easy.